Hi, everyone. We'll start very shortly. We'll start at 9 a.m. sharp US time. So in 2 minutes, we should be starting. Okay, welcome everyone to today's Laudato Si webinar. It's the third one out of a series of 5 webinars happening this week throughout Laudato Si week to celebrate the Laudato Si anniversary. Greetings from Buenos Aires, Argentina. My name is Tomás Insua, and I serve as the global coordinator of the Global Catholic Climate Movement of GCCM. And today I'm joined by a fantastic panel to discuss what should we do for our common home, exploring the key themes of Chapter 5 of this marvelous document, Laudato Si. And also as a reminder, so throughout this week of webinars, the first 2 webinars were about following the structure of the encyclical. So we're diving deep into each section of the encyclical. And now we'll be diving into the chapter 5, which is about action, right? So, and namely today I'll moderate this panel, this wonderful panel that includes Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, Dr. Carolyn Woo from CRS, from Catholic Relief Services, Bernd Nilles from CIDSE, and Boeve from 350.org. So the order I just said will be the order in which they will be speaking today. I would like to remind everyone that these webinars are a response to the Pope's call for dialogue. One of the most important themes of Laudato Si is that it's calling for dialogue. He explicitly says, I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we're shaping the future of our planet. So, and also I would like to mention, of course, the special historical moment to have this dialogue, given that Laudato Si was drafted as a contribution to the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were very recently adopted. Also, I would like to remind our audience that, besides understanding, this webinar, besides being about understanding this document and diving deeper into the message of Laudato Si, it's also about trying to live Laudato Si. So that's why we have the hashtag we're using is Live Laudato Si. So we encourage you, for those of you who are on Twitter, to use the hashtag Live Laudato Si. And just to dive straight away into the opening remarks by our panelists, we'll start with a series of opening remarks, about 5 minutes each of our panelists, about what they think are the main things that governments, businesses, and civil society should do to tackle the environmental crisis and climate change after Paris, in line with the call to action of Chapter 5 in Laudato Si. And also a quick reflection on significance of Laudato Si 1 year after its release. And then we'll dive into Q&A. So let's get started right away with Professor Sachs. So Jeff, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very, very much. What a joy it is to be with you and with this remarkable panel. And thank you to the Global Catholic Climate Movement for really bringing this global dialogue as Pope Francis has called for. If you think about the past year and the contribution of Laudato Si, it's truly historic. I have no doubt about it, because having been involved in the UN negotiations on a day-to-day basis, I know that Pope Francis played a unique role, and that Laudato Si played an absolutely pivotal and transformative global role. Pope Francis opened the minds of lots of people, and this remarkable document, which combines science in a very rigorous way with the theological insight, with practicality, and also with guidance to my community as educators to even give really pertinent advice about cross-disciplinary research and study in an integrated and holistic manner, is an invaluable and transformative encyclical. Well, as you said, in a very practical way, Pope Francis helped to bring about two historic agreements, one on September 25th at the UN headquarters, where he was the opening speaker to world leaders at a special session of the General Assembly, which adopted the new Sustainable Development Goals. And then just a few weeks after that, on December 12th, at the so-called COP21, the 21st meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we also had a unanimous agreement on the Paris Climate Agreement. And in both cases, both through the encyclical and through Pope Francis's personal leadership and the Vatican's role, we had a worldwide agreement on both of these huge agreements. It's important to understand how closely they're linked. The SDGs are 17 goals. SDG 13 had a kind of asterisk by it on September 25th last year, which said what the climate goal will be is to be adopted at the UN Framework Convention. And so the Paris Climate Agreement is incorporated within the overall rubric of sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Paris Climate Agreement says in many places, this climate agreement is in the context of sustainable development. Well, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis calls for an integral human development, an integral holistic approach. And this means combining economic, social, and environmental considerations in the service of human dignity and human well-being. And I think that's what we have with the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement potentially. Because, Tomás, as you know very well, these are unanimous declarations of intention, but now to implement them is a very tough process. And it's wonderful that in Laudato Si in chapter 5, Pope Francis calls for, and I quote, one world with a common plan, because he says that our interdependence behooves us to have a plan, and this has to be a global plan, of course, a plan that is integral within communities and in local context, but also a global plan. And the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement are the makings of a global plan. I'll say just a few words before I finish on what constitutes a global climate plan. Broadly speaking, of course, there are two dimensions to climate action. One is to mitigate climate change. That basically means stop the emission of greenhouse gases that are changing the climate. And the second is to be resilient and adaptive to the inevitable climate change that has already happened and that will continue for a while until we stabilize the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And since that's going to take some decades, there will be more climate change, more disruption, and more need for resilience. So it's mitigation and adaptation. I'll focus just a moment on the mitigation side. We need to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations. But since carbon dioxide stays in the air when it's put into the atmosphere, we have to stop the new emissions of carbon dioxide, bring them down to zero by around the middle of this century. The Paris Climate Agreement specifically says keep warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, even though we've already had 1 degree Celsius of global warming. We're more than halfway to the limit, and we will soon exceed that limit unless we take decisive action to reduce greenhouse emissions dramatically. Now, the major greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, though methane and nitrous oxide are also quite important. The major way that carbon dioxide is emitted is through fossil fuel use. The second way is through land use, especially deforestation. So what we need to do is shift from a high carbon economy based on coal, oil, and gas to a low carbon economy based especially on renewable energy like wind and solar, or hydropower and geothermal, and other low carbon technologies. We also have to shift the way we use energy so that it can be used on the basis of electricity rather than on directly burning fossil fuels. For example, instead of internal combustion engines in our automobiles, we'll need to have electric vehicles that are charged by low or zero carbon electricity. I want to highlight in the Paris Climate Agreement that there are 2 obligations of every government. One is to have an action agenda up to the year 2030, what's called a nationally determined contribution, or NDC. The second commitment is to have a low emission development strategy to the year 2050. So there are 2 time horizons. Governments are to make plans of action, one to 2030, one to 2050, in both cases showing how they will get down to zero in carbon emissions and stop the deforestation and, in fact, move to reforestation and rehabilitation of degraded land so that carbon can be stored and that land can be made productive again. I'll just end by saying that all of that was made at COP21. Next year's meeting is in Marrakesh, Morocco at COP22. I'm delighted that at COP22, I, in my capacity as UN advisor, and several other organizations, including the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, ICLEI for Urban Sustainability, and I hope the Global Catholic Climate Movement will discuss that together, will be joining together for a conference called the Low Emissions Solutions Conference. This is in line with Pope Francis to show the practical ways to achieve that goal of climate safety and of getting to zero in carbon emissions. Let me turn it back to you, Tomás. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity, and thanks to my fellow panelists who are all great leaders globally in this effort.
Thank you, Jeff. So I see that we had a lot of people join soon after we started. So who just presented was Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and Director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And also, I would just like to clarify that for the sake of time given, we have 60 minutes and we have wonderful speakers here. We'll keep all the introductions super, super short, so we have more time to discuss. All their amazing bios and CVs are posted in the conference website. So, and we'll, in the case of Jeff Sachs, we'll have the first question now after his presentation, because unfortunately Professor Sachs will have to leave a bit earlier. So I'll just jump straight to a question for you, Jeffrey, and then we'll move on with the presentations by the rest of the panelists. So the question for you, Jeff, is the following. So one of the most quoted lines in Laudato Si probably is the one that says that fossil fuels need to be progressively replaced without delay. As you just presented, we need to get rid of fossil fuels very, very soon. And in fact, today, a few hours ago, 4 Catholic religious orders announced that they will divest from fossil fuel companies. And this is, by the way, the first ever Catholic joint and divestment announcement, so it's pretty significant. So that's happening. That happened now, and we're expecting a lot of divestment action to start happening. So the question for you is, Jeffrey, that you're known for being very vocal, calling for divestment, both in your institution, Columbia University, and elsewhere. Could you summarize why you think that institutions like Columbia University and Catholic institutions should divest from fossil fuels and reinvest in clean energy?
Well, Tomás, bravo to these institutions. This is great news, and we will use it in our own advocacy for Columbia, which hasn't taken this decision yet, but we're still pushing for it, and I do expect progress this coming fall when the school year opens again. You know, we have to use every kind of signal to the utilities industry, the power generation, the companies, to move in the right direction. Part of that is government regulation. Part of that is plans of action of the kind that I emphasize, the 2030 plan, the 2050 plan. Part of that is from investors to say to companies, if you are on a track to continue developing fossil fuels, we don't want to own you, but we also want to make sure your share value will go down if you're investing in the wrong things that are socially harmful. That's what divestment signals. Divestment says we are only going to hold in our portfolios companies that are doing the right thing, that are morally responsible, and that are adhering sensibly to the global plan. And for a company now that says, oh, we don't believe in the Paris Climate Agreement, they're going to lose money for their investors down the road, because that Paris Climate Agreement is going to be implemented, and companies need to get on the right track on.
I think we lost Professor Sachs. Do the other panelists also lose Professor Sachs, or is it only me?
Yeah, I did lose him.
Okay. Okay, so looks like we lost him. Maybe he's having a connection issue. Let's wait a few more seconds to see if he's able to come back. Or on the contrary, we can move on to the next presentation. Let's give him a few seconds. And in the meantime, for those in the audience regarding fossil fuel divestment, this question on fossil fuel divestment, you can find more information that was tweeted earlier today. It's 4 religious orders, mainly from Australia, Catholic religious orders that divested. So that's a pretty interesting development. It's the first time this happens in a joint announcement. So that's very exciting. For more information on that, by the way, you can check our Twitter feed, the GCCM Twitter handle. You'll find the link to that announcement. So it looks like we're having trouble to get Professor Sachs back. Our team is trying to reach out to him and see if we can get him back on. So in the meantime, I suggest we just move on. And the next panelist presenting will be Dr. Carolyn Woo. She's the president and CEO of Catholic Relief Services, which is the official international humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic Church. And she has a very distinguished academic career as well, having served for a long time as dean of the Mendoza College of Business at Notre Dame University. So, and something very interesting to note is that Carolyn was, exactly 1 year ago, she participated in the Laudato Si press conference in Rome. So this webinar probably is bringing up memories from that. So that said, Carolyn, the floor is yours. We would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Tomás, thank you very much. Just want to give you a sense. Am I on the screen right now? Okay. CRS is over 70 years old. We were founded in 1943. We have been working in countries for over 70 years. We now work in over 100 countries. We serve about 100 million people. So we've actually seen the effects of climate change way before, because we deal with a lot of natural disasters. And so we are just delighted for the Pope's statement to bring this type of attention and a call to action. CIDSE, of course, is an implementation agency. So let me just talk about the three major types of efforts that we have. The first one is, of course, education. And we have prepared a lot of resources and videos because we encounter those problems. We work with fishermen, for example, at Lake Popo, which now has no water. I mean, you have to just kind of imagine what it means for people like that. So we have a lot of the education materials, and we particularly are targeted at universities, and in an initiative called I Am Climate Change, and that is getting a lot of feedback. The second major thing we do is advocacy with our US government in particular. As Dr. Sachs talked about, there are two types of policies we go after. One is mitigation, which is to continue to reduce carbon emission, move us to a low and then zero carbon economy. With the Bishops' Conference, we go for example, the Clean Power Plant Act, which is, again, guidelines and regulations to manufacturing, to the utility industry in terms of carbon emission. So there are mitigation and also adaptation. As I said, we have seen the devastation of climate change, and we have to take care of the people who have been affected by it. Just like I said, the fishermen who now have no water to fish in. We do this in a number of ways. We have testimonials in Congress. We do personal visits to many politicians. We also write op-eds. We also sign on in various statements. Right now, a lot of our focus is, of course, to make sure that the U.S. government makes its contribution to the Clean Climate Fund, which has already done the first installment, but we have to keep pressure on this. So that is our government advocacy work. The third part is really our field work, which is the core of our work. And there are two major prongs. One is in response to natural disasters. So, all of the climate events, which is whether incredible storms and earthquakes and also typhoons and so on. And there, our goal is really two things. Even before the disasters happen, we can see from the data that many countries are at risk. For those countries, we aim for two things. One is disaster risk reduction, which is what are the things that we can do that minimize the damage that could be done. The second is resilience. How can we help people bounce back much sooner? So those are our two, is to go for disaster risk reduction and also for resilience. A very, very big part of our work now is in agriculture. You could imagine drought, flood, heat, and also the consequences of certain type of insects that appear longer, earlier in a season. It's just devastated farming. It used to be 3 cycles of rain, 2 cycles of rain, now kind of 1 cycle of rain, but very unpredictable. We have seen the production in agriculture and the livelihoods just profoundly affected. And we are talking about several hundred millions of smallholder farmers. And so there, our whole plan is climate smart agriculture, which is a very holistic, comprehensive set of interventions. And what we do depends on what the local situations require. It always starts with restoring degraded soils, because degraded soils actually increase exposure and the damage to climate change. And if you don't fix that particular issue, all the other interventions would not work. So the whole area of, for example, restoring degraded soils. The second one is like making adjustment in cases, massive transition from one crop to another crop, like from maize to passion fruit, or from coffee to chocolate, for example. A lot of work also in the whole area of cover crops, shade trees. They're very important to reduce the temperature, of course, to also reduce carbon and also increase soil property, improve the soil properties. And I just give you a couple more, just like climate services. We now have so much data relating to soil, crops, weather, and so on, but farmers can't use that data. It needs to have intervention, whether it's extension agents, organizations like us. We have to change university curriculum. We also have to bring in the private sector in order to empower and also be a partner in terms of how we could assist regaining their livelihoods and adopting these new methods. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Carolyn. So now we'll just go ahead with all the presentations, and then we'll have a full session of Q&A at the end where, by the way, I would like to remind the audience that you'll see in your screen that you'll have a Q&A box. So please submit your questions for the panelists through that box. Next we have Bernd Nilles. Bernd is the Secretary General of CIDSE, which is an alliance of Catholic development agencies. He's based in Brussels. Bernd works in international development, started a long time ago, working in different organizations in Germany. He's from Germany. And since 2008, he's leading CIDSE. So, Bernd, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot to Caroline for speaking very much about what's going on the ground, because our 18 member organizations, similar to CIS, are doing a tremendous work to adapt to the existing climate change. Climate change is there, and the local communities are suffering worldwide. So we have the practical evidence, and we need to find indeed solutions for them, and need to work in solidarity with those suffering worldwide from climate change today. What CIDSE does as an international alliance is actually trying to build a bridge to the global negotiations. So since 2008, for example, we follow really closely the climate negotiations, and we are present at every COP, at every international climate talks, with often large Catholic delegations trying to influence also the negotiations. So we are kind of, when we look at Paris and the outcomes from last December, we can, to a certain degree, we can smile because we have some achievements. We have more than we thought we get. We have a review mechanism. We have, I think, a tremendous success that governments agreed finally on the objective to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is so important for the most poor and vulnerable communities. At the same time, Paris was, for many organizations, had also set outcomes that governments in the end couldn't agree actually on to tell us how exactly they want to achieve the change. They didn't agree on the mechanisms, they didn't agree on safeguards for food security, for human rights. So there's also a risk for false solutions. And so fighting climate change is a good thing on the one hand side, but we also see on the ground that there are also initiatives which can have a tremendously negative impact on people. And for example, there are also international companies now claiming for themselves, including McDonald's and others, that they would do climate smart agriculture. And we think the agreements are risky for poor communities. We need other approaches for local communities, like agroecology, for example. Now, I mean, we discussed today, couple of months, half a year after Paris and 1 year after Laudato Si has been published, how can we now actually move on? And before moving on, I think we need to look at two things. One is we need to look at the urgency factor. Science has released new data, and actually the shocking news is that Jeffrey Sachs spoke about decarbonization by mid-century, but actually to be able to reach the 1.5 degrees threshold, we know now that we actually have only a 66% chance to reach that objective by decarbonizing by 2030. And if we take the 2 degrees scenario, we have time to 2035. This is actually tomorrow. So we have waited too long. That unfortunately leaves only radical options of change to us. And here Pope Francis and Laudato Si give us a great help, because Pope Francis with Laudato Si explained to us and showed very nicely how actually the environmental and the social question belong together. In his words, how the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth are one cry. So we can actually, as Jeffrey Sachs was also referring to the Sustainable Development Goals, we can on the one hand side not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals under global warming. It's impossible. Global warming will destroy, for example, the rural areas where farmers are working. It will make it impossible for them to feed their families. At the same time, we cannot address climate change without completely changing our development paradigm, the way we do run our economies, our businesses, the way we live, the way we consume, the way we travel. So we have to embark on a radical change. And here I think Pope Francis and Laudato Si is really smart, because it tells us, look, as Catholic Church, we also do not have the exact new paradigm we can now give you on a one-pager and here you go and everybody knows what to do. But Laudato Si acknowledges that we need a dialogue not only on technical solutions, on small fixes, a little change here, a little change there. Laudato Si is telling us that we need a dialogue amongst all people, not only the Catholics, amongst all religions, all people, to understand how do we want to live in the future? How do we define well-being within the planetary boundaries we have, by respecting that we cannot emit any more further CO2 emissions, what is actually today, with all our knowledge, a kind of human rights violation. Pope Francis acknowledged that the atmosphere is a common good. It belongs to all people. So what I emit by flying on holidays, for example, into the atmosphere has an impact on my neighbors in the Philippines, on my neighbors in Europe, and my neighbors in Africa. So we from the CIDSE family, we would like to embark on this dialogue. We would like to build movements of change together with the Global Climate Change, Catholic Climate Change Campaign, 350.org, many others are very active for this. Let's build global movements for change. People need to connect to create the change together. We cannot wait for politics and business to bring us the solutions. It's up to us to change now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Bernd. Really insightful. Yeah. I like that call for dramatic changes, not incremental. So that said, let me introduce our final panelist, May Boeve. She's the executive director of 350.org and a co-founder of 350.org. You might know 350, I mean, being a key player of the climate movement, spearheading critical initiatives, I mean, ranging from the fossil fuel divestment movement to the People's Climate March in 2014, to the Keystone XL victory, to the Break Free actions last month. In other words, she's one of those key players of the ecological movement that Pope Francis praises in Laudato Si. It's really important to remember this, that in Laudato Si, Pope Francis is really positive in his remarks about the ecological movement and what the environmental movement has been doing for the last few decades, and 350 has been playing a key role. So that said, it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts, May, on what should we be doing next now that the Paris Agreement was signed. What is next, and overall, of course, your comments on the encyclical.
Wonderful. Is my sound okay? Good. Okay. Well, it's wonderful to be with you all in this conversation. And it was a real joy to actually go back and read through parts of Laudato Si and think about what's happened from the year it was written to now, and to really reflect on some of the messages that are included. So I'll get to that in a second. For people listening who don't know, 350, we were founded in 2008, right before another major UN conference, that time in Copenhagen. And our purpose then and our purpose now is to try and galvanize a global movement to confront climate change. And our belief is that unless there is a truly connected movement of people everywhere, we're not going to have the power we need to change this problem of climate change. And so that's what we do. We organize actions and mobilizations and campaigns that seek to get people involved. And increasingly, you'll see on my t-shirt, we're called 350 for a reason. And we were started because at that time, in 2008, we were trying to get into that round of international negotiations, the idea that we had to have 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in the treaty, in the agreement. And we're in a very different time now. As Bernd said, science has told us that our chances of even remaining below 2 degrees Celsius are extremely thin. So we are working on an urgent timeline, and our rallying cry right now is that we have to keep fossil fuels in the ground. The time to put more coal, oil, and gas into our economy and ultimately into the atmosphere is over. And the good news is we don't even need that anymore. We have an alternative. So in a nutshell, that's who we are and what we do. But I do want to talk a bit about the encyclical and what it suggests to us as an action agenda moving forward. To me, in reflecting on Laudato Si, the themes were both eternal on the one hand and very modern and very urgent, because the issue, after all, is about climate change and it requires urgent action now. But a lot of what is described in the writing are themes that have been true for humans as long as we've been around. And climate change is an issue rooted in justice and, unfortunately, injustice. So some of the things that most resonated to me in looking back on Chapter 5 a year later, the need for truly global action, the need for action at the right scale, the idea that both the political system and business is moving far too slowly in addressing the problem. There was a quote that really resonated, that honesty, courage, and responsibility are required to tackle the crisis. I think that's true for individuals, for governments, for anyone involved. And also, he wrote, the myopia of power politics delays inclusion of a far-sighted environmental agenda. So there's a very searing critique about what the political system as currently laid out can do about climate change without much more action on all of our parts. And finally, as a few others have commented, this need for dialogue between faiths, between movements, is essential for any kind of action to be taken. The piece that in many ways most animates us is that Pope Francis is crystal clear that the current development model based on intensive reliance on coal, oil, and gas cannot continue. And in its place, we need renewable energy options and new modes of production and consumption that can combat climate change. This is precisely what a growing movement of students, faith communities, socially responsible investors, and everyday people are calling on private and public institutions to do, which is to divest. And as we've already discussed in this webinar, today we saw great news about the 4 orders in the Pacific who have chosen to divest and instead seeking to reinvest in the solutions that we truly need. In the words of the Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, investing in fossil fuel companies and in eco-destructive projects is synonymous with supporting the destruction of our future. Divestment provides the means to change this status quo, to shift towards a system that will prioritize the welfare of the people and of nature over the relentless pursuit of profit. Thankfully, many leaders have responded, and many institutions as well, like the Unitarian Universalists, the United Church of Christ, the Church of England, the World Council of Churches, and recently the World Lutheran Federation. The tide is turning. And now, if I could be so bold as to say, it's time to divest the Vatican and the many other Catholic universities, dioceses, and orders. With the ear of 1.2 billion Catholics and the respect of Christians and non-Christians alike, Pope Francis is uniquely positioned to add both his voice and the unique moral power of his office to the divestment movement. With Laudato Si, Pope Francis has chosen to stand with a people who fight for justice and a sustainable planet. He understands the moral imperative of caring for creation. He understands that if we do nothing, then the impacts of climate change will be horrific and will fall hardest on the world's most vulnerable people, as my co-panelists have already spoken to. So divestment is a key way for Pope Francis to be acting further on the call to action that he put out in Laudato Si, and we and the divestment movement stand ready to support that however best we can. Thank you.
Great, wonderful, very compelling. Thanks, May, for that call to action. So, well, that said, thanks all of our wonderful panelists for your presentations and your opening remarks. I would like to remind the audience that we're doing Q&A now. I'll just get started with one question for each of them. We'll try to keep them short for the sake of time. The idea is to keep the webinar under 60 minutes. So let me get started with a question for Carolyn. So given your experience as Dean of the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame, and also given the theme of your presentation 1 year ago in the Vatican on the role of business, could you dive a bit deeper into what you think is the role for businesses in driving the dramatic change we need? And also, in a related note, can businesses do this alone, or and to what degree they need pressure from civil society to nudge them or regulate them more severely to really get us on track for this dramatic changes we need?
So, Tomás, I want to use two examples. I'm no longer with Notre Dame, so I'm thoughtful about not speaking on their behalf. But I want to cite an example which I think is the direction to go. In September of 2015, last year, the Notre Dame Business School hosted a conference on climate investment. I think there's so much focus on just divestment, and actually the need is really bringing in a lot of new energy, new money, new ideas to really allow the renewable solutions to become cost effective. And I think that we need a lot more attention on this whole issue of climate investment. And I was so excited to see that because it allows students to imagine a future, their future, of how they could use business to contribute to a zero carbon economy. So I just want to cite that as an example. When you talk about does business need more pressure, does government need more pressure, and even the civil society needs more pressure, I think the answer is yes. I think we acting together with the voices, bringing out different perspectives are very important. I think businesses are very responsive to consumers and to investors. Those are the two biggest groups before they are responsive to government. They lobby a lot. But I think the movement of consumers, what they say, what they would buy, what they would not buy, and employees nowadays, the battle for talent, for example, and this generation of talent have certain values. So I think there are roles that investors can play to ask for disclosure, to see how businesses are, the UN Global Compact, I think, is a good example of the type of disclosures which are necessary. But as investors and consumers, I think we could actually do a lot. I actually see different type of coalitions. I just want to also make one point. Sometimes we say anyone who does not divest. is therefore not part of this movement. I want to give the example of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is paying the price both ways. It's now the part of the world which has the most number of earthquakes. And because of fracking and so on, it has over 900 earthquakes a year. And yet its economy is completely dependent, not completely, but very much dependent on carbon. And so they are dealing with the issues. They are paying the price. It's not like they ignore and do not know the effect of earthquakes. It's really how to balance an economy where many jobs are involved, and at the same time, the price of those jobs is earthquakes. So I think that missing in this conversation is the transition journey. How do you bring people along who are their livelihoods are tied to the old sector? And in this transition, how do we also take them and address those issues in this transition? So those are some of my comments.
Perfect. Thanks, Carolyn. So next, a question for you, Bernd. So one question is, we've been talking about the need to transition to renewable energy. First of all, the question is 100% renewable energy possible and desirable? Also looking at the other energy technology options there. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. And yeah, let's talk about that, the feasibility and desirability of 100% renewable powered future. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks for that question. The question is very important because many people worldwide have still no access to energy or no stable or safe access to energy. So we actually have to increase tremendously the access to energy. And related to climate change, we have to do that 100% renewable. Any further investment has to be 100% renewable. Governments still spend billions of subsidies for fossil fuel energy, and that is really wrong, and that needs to stop immediately. But I also believe that 100% renewables is possible in a general sense, because we need to rethink also the degree of energy we actually consume. 10% of the world population, and I guess most of the people on this call, whom I unfortunately do not know personally, but I guess many of us, including myself, we belong to the 10% most wealthiest, who cause 50% of all emissions worldwide. So we concentrate a lot of the ecological damage we have in the world, we cause with a very small group. So actually we have to also rethink how much energy can I personally actually consume. And that has also to do with my lifestyle. So I have to fundamentally rethink, for example, the question often people ask, can I still fly? I think it's a very interesting question. And the question is interesting because we are so used to do it. It became like a right, like a normal habit. But actually the vast majority of the world population has no access to these transport means. Can I still drive by car? The vast majority of world population has no access to have a car. They have not the financial means to afford a car. So the interesting thing is to work for a Catholic organization like CIDSE and to read Catholic teaching like Laudato Si is that we, by taking a radically global lens, looking at all people on this planet, having the same dignity, having the same rights, also the same rights of access to resources, we have to share. We have radically to share the resources we have. We cannot throw things away. We need to, if we take resources out of the earth, we have to use them a lot longer, if not forever. Wasting needs radically to be reduced and stopped. We need to give things a value. How many people throw their mobile phones they bought a year ago away because they get from the company new one? These kind of habits are fundamentally wrong. So that's what I meant earlier with we have to really make the effort to rethink and to think about what is really important for my life. Can I travel also to the neighbor region where I live and find it beautiful, or do I have to go thousands of kilometers away on holidays? These are very concrete questions. And to be honest, when we look at the damage we create worldwide currently with the way we are living, as Pope Francis said, we are indifferent to all the damage and the suffering we create in the world. Actually, taking that into account, I think it's really time to focus on the things which are really important for happiness, for the well-being of my family. To live in a true solidarity with people worldwide is so crucial. And in CIDSE, just to give you, I will finish in a second, just to give you one example, I mean, also because the issue of transition had been addressed. I mean, we don't want to let people alone with these questions. CIDSE, for example, we have created a global campaign, Change for the Planet, Care for the People. We want to accompany people in this change. We want to help people to exchange with people how the change is possible. But that the change needs to happen is out of question from my point of view.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Bernd. And lastly, before we open up to questions from the audience, a question for you, May. As mentioned earlier, Pope Francis praised the ecological movement in the sea and calls for more pressure to be exerted. What is your thinking about the best ways for the climate movement to exert pressure now that the Paris Agreement was adopted? And for example, I mean, maybe recalling civil disobedience happening in Break Free. I mean, what are your thoughts on the best ways moving forward to really build up pressure?
Thank you. Well, I think the wonderful thing about what's happening in the climate movement right now is there is so much creativity and there is so much action. And so depending on where you live, depending on what you're interested in, there are so many ways to be involved. And if I've conveyed anything in this conversation, it's that we have a very short amount of time, but there is so much that can be done. And I would encourage people who are tuning into this webinar. Many of you may already be involved in the movement, or maybe you read Laudato Si and you were inspired to take some action, but there are so many ways to plug in. And that is how we build pressure. It's not necessarily that everyone does the same thing. It is that everyone is taking appropriate action, and we often use the phrase escalation. What does that mean? It means that what you're doing in your life to combat this problem, how can you take it to another level? And it's similar to what Bernd is saying, that now is a moment to really think, am I doing what I can be doing the best way I can be doing it? And I think some of what is compelling about Laudato Si, and when earlier I mentioned it poses these eternal questions, that this isn't just a political call to action about climate change. This is a moral call to action. So the idea that we are actually examining in ourselves, what is it that we can be doing to make the most impact in this movement at this moment, is an essential question. And I think many people turn to their faith traditions, I certainly do, in asking themselves how to answer that question. So broadly speaking, that's what I would say. And if you want to get involved in a distributed divestment campaign, you can easily do that at gofossilfree.org. There you can also learn about, as Carolyn was saying, the other side of the equation. How do we reinvest? How do we move the money from the problem into the solution? And just on a very specific example, in terms of how do people keep up the pressure, we, as Tomás was saying, most recently were part of a global action called Break Free. And I was able to participate in the action in Albany, New York, which is the one closest to where I live. And I got to spend the day with dozens of people in kayaks and canoes trying to raise attention to the idea that oil is being transported on trains through Albany, New York, the capital of the state of New York. And the amount of commitment and passion and joy from all the people around me with their kayaks. Someone had her whole family with her. Another guy had his dog in his canoe. But people were united in their call to be part of this movement. And many people had never done anything like this before. It came with some risk, but they thought, now is the time for me, join together with my community, to take this risk. And I had never done anything like that before, and it re-inspired me. So as you're listening to this, I would just encourage everyone to think about what is something that I have wanted to do, a risk I need to take to be part of making the climate movement stronger, and to take that and use Laudato Si as part of your inspiration for that. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Great. So now we'll dive into more questions. And for the sake of time, I propose our wonderful panelists, let's try to keep questions to 1-2 minutes, so we try to get a few answered. So the first one is for Carolyn. Marilu from Alberta, Canada is asking, thank you, Carolyn, for bringing up the need for transition and how we can do this. This is the problem we have here in Alberta, the heartland of fossil fuels. Any ideas on how to do this transition? And I would add this, I mean, this concept of the just transition. How do we ensure this just transition for people in the working for the fossil fuel industry?
By the way, I think that is the key to unlocking much more support for climate change actions, because of the workers who really don't know what to do. This type of transition is not the first time we see. We've technologically have been changing. You know, we no longer have switchboards, for example, right? We have a lot of switchboard operators. I think a very strong work transition program that allows people who are displaced to have some guaranteed income level for a certain period of time, and also retraining, that there are subsidies for going back to school, for example, for these workers. So, you know, it's still going to be hard, these type of transitions. The burden falls on one group, but the benefit is global. So in this case, at least sort of a explicit acknowledgement of those type of burdens and challenges, and putting together a plan. And I think that President Obama was actually trying to get at that, of these type of displacements of workers and the type of work retraining, and in some ways an insurance for some of these workers. These plans have been proposed at different theoretical approaches, but there's just no stomach for politicians to provide this type of support. And I think that that is the key, by the way, for activists moving on this. I think there are just too many people whose livelihoods are tied to carbon.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. And here's a related question, also from Canada, this time for May. Monica from Canada is asking, sometime the other day was speaking about the investment and saying that changing our economic models away from carbon would be disastrous for the economy. What would you answer to that argument, that it's too expensive for industry and for the overall economy to transition away from fossil fuels?
In many places where there are divestment campaigns, the winning argument has actually been that investors are losing money from investing in coal. And so that's important to remember. And I would also encourage looking at the work of an organization called As You Sow, which has been helping to get this story told, as well as some of the work of Lord Stern in the UK, and actually looking at what is the global economic shift going to cost and going to require. So there are resources available. Those are two to look at. I would also say that we're also trying to make clear that we do need the economy to work totally differently. So we're in this moment where we are transitioning. And I don't think it's a question even now of whether we're transitioning. It is, how is it happening? How quickly is it happening? And how fair is it going to be for the people who are affected most? So I would also encourage reading Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which in many ways is about trying to pose these questions. And she was, of course, in conversation with Pope Francis around the encyclical as well. So those are some different resources to look at as you are in your campaigns being asked this question.
Perfect. Next question is for you, Bernd. We have Robert who is asking, to get to 100% renewables will require a change in mode of thinking from our current linear model to thinking holistically. What is to be done? I mean, what is being done to develop this capacity to think holistically? And I think this is very related to the whole paradigm shift work that you're doing at CIDSE. So I'm sure you have a good answer for that.
Yeah, this shift also in thinking is fundamental, and I think Pope Francis gave us with Laudato Si a major gift in guiding us how to do that. And I think the first thing he's indeed mentioning is the spaces for dialogue to bring people together. That's why we are also talking about connecting people, movement building. We need to bring people together in canoes, as May said, or somewhere else. It's so crucial to connect people. If people are sitting at one table and talking about these issues, they come to wonderful solutions. And the interesting thing is that most of the solutions are there. So it's very interesting to work in the development sector in international cooperation, because we are actually promoting and financing locally adapted solutions worldwide since decades, and they flourish and they work. But we are not able, because of political circumstances, economic pressure, certain companies dominating and holding this flourishing of the local approaches back. These local initiatives cannot move on, cannot flourish. It's very sad to see how many good initiatives of people get held back by corporate power, by interests of some individuals, interests of political forces. So I think Pope Francis in Laudato Si, when you read it carefully, he's blaming the forces who are holding us back from this new way of living and working, is blaming them harshly. He's using a very radical language many of us will probably not use in their work. It's fantastic encouragement. So we need to be honest to each other. We need to talk about the tough stuff and not hide it by being only nice to each other. We need to also challenge our neighbors and friends and saying, look, we need to embark on that, and let's talk about how can we do it differently. That's the start of everything. And then we will make it and we can make the change. But it has to be fast, radical, fair, and socially just to everybody. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Bernd. So we are on time. There are lots of very good questions lined up, but unfortunately we promised we will keep it under 60 minutes, so we'll keep that promise. I would like to thank very much our wonderful panelists today, May, Bernd, Carolyn, and Professor Sachs, who unfortunately had to, he lost the connection, so it was good we had the chance to attend his presentation anyways. So thanks for this very stimulating conversation about what we need to do for our common home and for our brothers and sisters who are suffering the worst impacts of the environment from environmental degradation. I would encourage all of you in the call, those who are Catholics, to of course join the Global Catholic Climate Movement. We have a lot going on. There's also, I would like to remind you that, as you see in the screen, tomorrow we have the next webinar, which will be about chapter 6 of the encyclical about ecological education and spirituality. And it will be a very interesting panel as well, because it will be an interfaith panel. So we'll have Cardinal Onayekan from Nigeria on the Catholic side, and there will be many faith leaders from different traditions joining him. So please join our webinar tomorrow. It happens at the same time. And I would just encourage you to continue the conversation online using the hashtag #LiveLaudato Si. And well, looking forward to work together with all of you, and of course with our panelists and your organizations on driving the drastic and radical change we need to avert the wars. To really bring to life this wonderful message of Laudato Si and Pope Francis. So let's honor his message by putting it into practice and bringing to life this Laudato Si encyclical. So thank you very much, and well, we'll stay in touch. See you tomorrow, hopefully in the next panel.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Great being with everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Caroline.
Bye.
Bye, Thomas.